My mother's vintage Samsonite hit the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. It didn't break, but the latch popped, spilling her silk scarves across the foyer. My father's body had been wheeled out of the house exactly 4 hours ago, and his grieving widow was already doing spring cleaning. "It's time to face reality, Alara," Beatrice said. She stood at the top of the stairs, swirling a glass of neat scotch. She wasn't wearing black. She was wearing an emerald silk robe that cost more than my first car. The house was choked with the scent of expensive vanilla candles, Beatrice's signature, trying to drown out the lingering clinical smell of my father's final days. "Reality is that this is my home, Beatrice," I said, my voice steadier than my hands. My forensic auditor brain was already cataloging her tells. The forced tilt of her chin, the way she didn't look at the empty space where the hospice bed had been. "It was your home," she corrected, her smile sharp and surgical. "But I checked the deeds while you were busy holding a dead man's hand. This house is for family. You're just a guest who stayed a decade too long. Pack the rest or I'll have the gardener mulch it." She didn't just want me gone. She wanted to erase the very idea that I belonged here. I returned 2 hours later with a rental van, my heart hammering against my ribs. I only wanted the jeweler box, my mother's pearls and the sapphire ring my father promised me on my 16th birthday. I didn't even get to the porch. A silver van was parked in the circular driveway. A man in a blue jumpsuit was kneeling by the front door, his tools laid out with clinical precision. The heavy brass locks, the ones my father had hand-polished every Sunday, were being replaced with sleek, digital keypads. "I live here," I told the locksmith, my voice cracking. "I need to get my things." He didn't look up. "Sorry, lady." The owner, Mrs. Vance, said the former tenant might try to gain unauthorized entry. "I've got orders to call the police if anyone lingers." Former tenant. The words were a physical blow to the stomach. Beatrice appeared at the window, pulling the sheer curtains back just enough to let me see her sipping her drink. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. I retreated to the curb, clutching a single damp photograph of my parents I'd managed to tuck into my waistband earlier. I was standing on the sidewalk of the street that bore my family name, and for the first time in 27 years, I was technically homeless. The funeral was a masterpiece of performance art. Beatrice sat in the front row, draped in a black lace veil that suggested a Victorian tragedy. She'd even managed to squeeze out a few tears, which she dabbed away with a handkerchief embroidered with my father's initials. I was relegated to the fourth row, flanked by distant cousins who smelled like mothballs and avoided my eyes. I watched from the shadows as Beatrice delivered a eulogy she clearly hadn't written. She spoke of his long struggle and our private sanctuary, painting me as the estranged, troubled daughter who was too overwhelmed to help with the arrangements. "Alara has always struggled with the weight of her father's legacy," she sighed into the microphone, her voice trembling perfectly. My gaze locked on her throat. She was wearing them. My mother's pearls. The ones she'd kicked down the stairs. Seeing them against her skin felt like watching a thief flaunt the spoils of a heist. The dry irony hit me. She was using my father's death to fund her social rebranding. As the priest gestured for the final prayer, Beatrice leaned over to the mayor's wife and whispered something that made them both chuckle quietly. The grieving widow was already shopping for her next life. Mr. Henderson's law office was a mahogany tomb. He had been my father's lawyer for 30 years, or so I thought. He didn't look at me as he adjusted his spectacles. Beatrice sat across from me, her hand resting on a designer handbag that probably cost 5 figures. "To my wife, Beatrice," Henderson read, his voice a flat drone, "I leave the entirety of the Vance estate, including all properties, liquid assets and holdings." The air left my lungs. "That's impossible. My father told me." "He told you what you wanted to hear, dear," Beatrice interrupted, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "He knew you couldn't handle the responsibility. Your career as an auditor is just playing with numbers. This is a business." Henderson cleared his throat. "There is a final provision for Alara. A box of childhood mementos currently located in the basement of the estate. To be collected within 48 hours. I looked at the legal documents. The signature looked like my father's, but the ink was too fresh, the wording too uncharacteristic. Beatrice stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Go play in the dirt with your toys, honey. The grown-ups have a legacy to manage." She left me with $42 in my checking account and a box of trash. Or so she thought. The Motel 6 on the edge of town smelled like cheap cigarettes and desperation. I sat on the edge of the saga mattress, the box of toys at my feet. It was filled with old stuffed animals, a broken kaleidoscope, and a wooden rocking horse my father had carved for me when I was 6. I picked up the horse, my fingers tracing the familiar grooves. Something was wrong. The weight was off-center. I shook it, and a dull thunk echoed from inside the base. I used a nail file to pry at the bottom plate. It popped open, revealing a heavy brass key and a business card for a lawyer named Arthur Sterling. On the back, in my father's cramped, frantic handwriting, were the words, "They think they've won. Go to the cabin attic. Don't sign a single paper for Henderson. I'm sorry, Elara." I had to hide the truth to keep it safe. The audit began in my head. If Henderson was the estate lawyer, why did I have a key for a stranger? My father wasn't senile. He was terrified. He hadn't left me a box of toys. He'd left me a blueprint. I checked my phone. I had no job, no house, and a stepmother who wanted me dead. But I had the key. And for the first time since the funeral, the vanilla scent in my head was replaced by the sharp, clear smell of my mother's lavender. The cabin was a 3-hour drive into the mountains, a place Beatrice always called a primitive shack. To my father, it was a sanctuary. To me, it was the only place that still smelled like him. Pine needles and old parchment, not that suffocating vanilla Beatrice used to mark her territory. The brass key from the rocking horse turned the lock with a heavy, satisfying click. I didn't head for the kitchen or the bedroom. I went straight for the attic pull-down stairs. The air up there was thick with dust and the ghosts of better years. In the corner, under a tarp, sat a steel filing cabinet. My auditor's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't a shack. It was a backup drive. I found a folder labeled B, Background. Inside were copies of marriage and divorce records from a small town in Italy. My father had hired a private investigator years ago. Beatrice's finalized divorce from her first husband, a minor European businessman, didn't exist. There was no decree absolute. The dates overlapped her wedding to my father by 3 years. The irony was delicious. She had kicked me out for not being family, yet she wasn't even legally a Vance. She wasn't a widow. She was a bigamist. But as I dug deeper, I found something even better. A document with a gold seal that made the house deed Beatrice was flaunting look like a grocery list. Arthur Sterling didn't look like a shark. He looked like a retired history professor, tucked away in a dusty office that smelled of rain and leather. But when he saw the brass key, his eyes sharpened into flints. "Your father knew this day would come, Elara," he said, laying out a document that felt heavier than its weight in paper. "This is the Vance Bloodline Trust. It was established by your grandfather, not your father." I scanned the legalese, my eyes darting to the core clauses. The estate, the mansion, the grounds, the family name, was held in a life estate. My father was a steward, not an owner. Upon his death, the property was mandated to revert immediately to the living heir of his first marriage. "Me," I whispered. "Precisely," Sterling said, leaning back. "Beatrice's updated will is irrelevant. Your father couldn't leave her the house because he never legally owned it in the first place. It's been yours since the moment his heart stopped. Why didn't he tell me? Because Beatrice was monitoring his every move. He was afraid she'd find a way to destroy the original trust before he passed. He had to play the part of the submissive husband to keep the blueprint safe." I felt a surge of cold, clinical power. I was currently living in a motel, but legally, I was the landlord of the woman who had kicked me out. I didn't rush to the courthouse. Revenge is a dish best served after a thorough audit. I drove back to the estate and parked my rental van behind a row of overgrown hedges. Through my binoculars, I watched Beatrice on the north terrace. She wasn't alone. An auctioneer was walking through the house, tagging my mother's furniture with neon green stickers. They were standing over the Louis XIV desk where I'd done my homework for a decade. Beatrice laughed, a high brittle sound that drifted across the lawn. She looked like a woman who had just won the lottery, oblivious to the fact that she was essentially selling stolen goods. "That desk is worth at least 80,000, I heard her say through the parabolic mic I'd bought at an electronics shop. "Make sure it's in the front of the catalog. I need the liquidity for the engagement party." Engagement party. My father hadn't been in the ground a week, and she was already eyeing a new host. I didn't call the police. I didn't storm the gate. I just hit record on my phone, capturing every second of her selling off my inheritance. In the world of forensic auditing, we call this establishing intent. Every sticker she placed was another nail in her own coffin. The motel room was a mess of spreadsheets and cold coffee. Using the login credentials I found in the cabin, I bypassed the Vanguard design firewall and accessed my father's private medical accounts. Beatrice had been clever, but she wasn't an auditor. She had been funneling money into a shell company called BV Wellness. On paper, it was for alternative end-of-life care. In reality, the payments matched the invoices for a luxury condo in the city and a series of high-end jewelry purchases. She had been draining my father's liquid assets while he was too weak to check the balance. She hadn't just been a bad wife. She'd been a professional parasite. I tracked a $50,000 wire transfer that had left the account the day after the funeral. It went to a bank in Italy. My gut twisted. She wasn't just spending the money. She was paying someone off. Likely, the ex-husband she'd never actually divorced. I looked at my bank balance. $12. I was down to my last few dollars, but I had the digital fingerprints of her entire fraud. I didn't need a lawyer yet. I needed a predator. I picked up the phone and called a PR firm that specialized in reputation management, or, in this case, reputation destruction. I walked into the salon as a troubled, estranged daughter, and walked out as a weapon. I cut my long, limp hair into a sharp, asymmetrical bob and traded my morning rags for a tailored charcoal suit I bought on credit. The woman in the mirror didn't look like she lived in a Motel 6. She looked like she owned the bank that owned the motel. Status report? I asked, my voice dropping an octave. The leaks are working, my PR contact, Julian, said over the encrypted line. The social registry just received an anonymous tip about Beatrice's mounting debts. The boutiques on Fifth Avenue are already discussing her credit risk in their private circles. Phase 1 of the long game was psychological warfare. I wanted Beatrice to feel the walls closing in before I ever set foot on the property. That afternoon, I sat in a cafe across from Le Cirque, watching as Beatrice attempted to host a high society lunch. When the check arrived, she slid her black Amex across the table with a practiced flourish. The waiter returned a minute later, leaning in to whisper. Beatrice's face went from smug to a ghostly mottled white. Her card had been declined. In front of the 3 most influential women in the city. She looked toward the window, and for a split second, our eyes met. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just took a slow, methodical sip of my tea. I didn't need to break down the front door. I just needed to invite the city to look at it. I sent Leo, a former structural engineer who'd been blacklisted by Beatrice's circle, to the estate. He arrived in a high-vis vest with a clipboard that carried the weight of a death warrant. Structural rot in the load-bearing beams, Leo told her, his voice projecting across the lawn where Beatrice was trying to supervise a gardener. And the plumbing in the West Wing? It's a violation of City Code 402. I'm placing a cautionary lien on the property until a full audit is performed. Beatrice looked like she'd swallowed a wasp. Do you have any idea who I am? This house is a landmark. It's a hazard, Leo replied, barely glancing up from his notes. I watched from the tree line, the irony tasting like expensive wine. The house wasn't rotting, but her claim to it was. By the time he left, a bright orange notice of violation was slapped onto the mahogany front door. It was the first time in 30 years a Vance property had been marked as substandard. The grieving widow spent the rest of the afternoon screaming into her phone at lawyers who were already starting to ignore her calls. She was beginning to realize that the Vance name didn't open doors when the locks were being investigated. At 3 a.m., the mansion was silent, save for the rhythmic humming of the overtaxed HVAC system. I used my brass key on the servant's entrance. The air inside was cloying. Beatrice had tripled the number of vanilla candles, a frantic attempt to scent mark every corner of my heritage. I moved with the silence of a shadow. I didn't steal the silver or the paintings. I went to the storage room and retrieved my mother's portrait, the one Beatrice had hidden behind a stack of old rugs. I hung it in the grand hallway, directly opposite Beatrice's bedroom door. Then, I swapped her expensive French lavender soap with the cheap medicinal bar she'd forced me to use as a child. A small, petty correction. I sat in the darkness of the library for a moment, my hand resting on the leather-bound books that smelled like my father. I felt like a ghost, but a ghost with a plan. As I left, I heard a floorboard creak upstairs, followed by a sharp, stifled gasp. Beatrice had found the portrait. I didn't need to stay to hear the rest. The psychological foundation was cracking. She was living in a house that was starting to remember its true owners, and the vanilla was losing the fight. Beatrice was desperate for liquidity. She'd organized a private estate sale to offload my mother's $100,000 crystal chandelier, the centerpiece of the ballroom. I arrived in a wide-brimmed hat and oversized glasses, sitting in the back row of the boutique auction house. Starting bid, $50,000, the auctioneer droned. Beatrice stood by the bar, sipping champagne, her eyes gleaming with greed. She needed this sale to pay off the caterers for her upcoming engagement gala. 60, a voice called out. 75, I counted, my voice low and disguised. The bidding climbed to 90. Beatrice was beaming. Just as the hammer was about to fall, Mr. Sterling stepped through the double doors, a sheriff's deputy at his side. "Stop the sale," Sterling announced, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "We have a filed injunction. The provenance of this item is under legal dispute via the Vance Bloodline Trust. Any buyer will be cited for receiving stolen property." The room went ice cold. The bidders lowered their paddles as if they were made of lead. Beatrice's glass hit the floor, shattering into 1,000 diamonds that were worth more than her current reputation. I stood up, tucked my paddle into my bag, and walked past her. "Disappointing turn of events," I whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. I really liked that light. In the world of forensic auditing, you don't just find the money. You follow the debt. Beatrice had been living on a house of cards, using BV Wellness as collateral for high-interest personal loans from a boutique bank in the city. I sat in Sterling's office, looking at a digital transfer screen. "Is it done?" "Signed and sealed," Sterling said. "Your father's liquid trust was large enough to buy out her entire portfolio of private debt. You are no longer just her estranged daughter. You are her primary creditor." I looked at the paperwork. Beatrice owed $400,000 in backdated lifestyle loans, and missed payments on her luxury SUV. "Send the notice," I said, "and make sure the interest rate reflects her high-risk status. I want her to feel the weight of every cent she stole from my father's medical fund." That evening, a courier delivered a thick envelope to the mansion. It wasn't an invitation. It was a demand for payment in full within 7 business days. I knew she didn't have it. She had spent the last of her cash on the deposits for her engagement party to Harold Sterling, no relation to Arthur, a billionaire widower with a soft spot for elegant blondes. She was selling the furniture to pay the debts, but I had blocked the sales. She was trapped in a gilded cage, and the bars were made of her own signatures. The mansion was glowing, filled with the city's elite for Beatrice's grand announcement. She had gone all out, white lilies, a string quartet, and a 5-course meal she couldn't afford. She looked radiant in a silver gown, clutching Harold's arm as if he were a life raft. "To our future," Harold toasted, raising a glass to the applauding crowd. I stepped into the light of the ballroom, my charcoal suit a sharp contrast to the sea of silk. The room went quiet. Beatrice's smile didn't just fade. It curdled. "Ilara," she hissed, stepping toward me. "I had you barred at the gate. The gate belongs to the trust, Beatrice. And I'm the trustee," I said loud enough for Harold to hear. "I didn't come for the champagne. I came to bring you a wedding gift." I handed Harold a sleek, black envelope. A little background check for the man who has everything. Including, apparently, a fiancé who is still legally married to a man in Milan. I looked at the crowd, then at Beatrice, whose face was the color of sour milk. "Happy engagement, Beatrice. It's a shame it's also a felony." I turned and walked out, the silence behind me more satisfying than any applause. The chess match was over. Now it was time for the complication. I returned to the Motel 6 to find the door kicked in. The room didn't just look robbed. It looked desecrated. My father's wooden rocking horse, the one that had held the key to my survival, was a pile of charred splinters in the middle of the stained carpet. The toys were gone. The smell hit me first. Not smoke, but cloying, synthetic vanilla. Beatrice hadn't just come for the documents. She'd come to leave her scent on my ruin. She thought she'd burned the bloodline trust. She thought she'd turned my only evidence into ash. I stood in the center of the wreckage, my hands steady. I didn't cry. Crying doesn't balance a ledger, and it certainly doesn't rebuild a legacy. I looked at the black soot on my floor. She had missed the fundamental rule of forensic auditing. Never assume the original is the only copy. Did you find what you were looking for, Beatrice? I whispered to the empty, smelling room. I reached into the hidden lining of my charcoal blazer and felt the cool, laminated surface of the high-resolution scans I'd made at the cabin. The paper was gone, but the data was eternal. Beatrice had just committed breaking and entering, arson, and destruction of property. She thought she was erasing my past, but all she did was provide me with the criminal record I needed to bury her. The blue and red lights strobed against the motel's dingy brick walls. I wasn't the one who called them. Lara Vance? The officer asked, his hand resting on his holster. We have a warrant for your arrest. Grand larceny and possession of stolen property. Beatrice stood behind the patrol car, a silk handkerchief pressed to her eyes. She took my mother-in-law's sapphire ring. Officer. I found the empty box in her room earlier today when I came to beg her to come home. I felt the cold bite of the handcuffs. My internal monologue was a series of rapid-fire calculations. She'd planted the jewelry. She'd used the breaking and entering to frame me for a theft I didn't commit. In the eyes of the law, I wasn't a victim. I was a disgruntled thief. I have nothing to say without my lawyer, I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. Beatrice leaned in as they shoved me into the back seat, her voice a poisonous thread. Enjoy the cell, honey. By the time you get out, the trust will be a memory and Harold will have bought the judge. You played the queen, but you forgot you're just a pawn I stepped on. As the car pulled away, I watched her smirk. She thought the system was her weapon. She didn't realize I'd been studying the system's flaws for a long time. 24 hours later, Sterling bailed me out, but the damage was done. The larceny charge was all over the local blogs. Beatrice was moving fast, attempting to bribe Nurse Maria, the woman who had sat by my father's bed for months. I met Maria in a darkened corner of a park. She was trembling. She offered me 50,000, Ilara. She wanted me to sign a statement saying your father was suffering from vascular dementia when he spoke to Arthur Sterling. She said if I didn't, she'd make sure I never worked in this state again. And? I asked, my heart tightening. Maria reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. She forgot I've dealt with bullies in the ICU for 20 years. I didn't take the money. But I got her on tape admitting she knew about the trust and was trying to nullify the ramblings of a dying man. The reveal was a tectonic shift. Beatrice had just admitted the trust existed while trying to claim it was the product of a broken mind. She had handed us the proof of her own awareness of the legal stakes. Thank you, Maria, I said, my hand tightening on the recorder. The complication was turning into a trap of her own making. She was getting desperate, and desperate people leave footprints. My father hadn't been senile. He had been a master of misdirection, and Maria was the final witness he'd prepared. The counter-strike was brutal. Harold, Beatrice's billionaire fiancé, used his charitable influence to freeze Arthur Sterling's firm's bank accounts under a suspicious activity flag. They're suffocating us, Ilara, Sterling said, his office lights flickering. The building manager had suddenly discovered a wiring issue. I can't pay my staff. The court date for the eviction is being pushed back by clerical errors. Harold has the city in his pocket. He doesn't have the city, I replied, staring at a map of Harold's real estate holdings. He has the people who like his checks. But billionaires are allergic to one thing: bad press that affects their stock price. I realized then that Beatrice wasn't the only target anymore. Harold was the shield, and I needed to shatter it. I pulled up the BV Wellness files. One of the largest investors in Beatrice's shell company was a subsidiary of Harold's main corporation. He wasn't just marrying her. He was laundering money through her wellness scam. Sterling, don't worry about the lights, I said, the dry irony of the situation settling in. We don't need electricity to file a federal whistleblower report with the SEC. If Harold wants to play dirty, I'm going to make sure his legacy smells like a trash fire. The stakes were no longer just a house. It was a war of attrition, and I was the only one who knew how to starve the enemy. The invitation arrived via courier in a tuxedo. A heavy, cream-colored card with gold leaf. A celebration of closure. Dinner at the Vance estate. 8 p.m. Beatrice had won, or so the town believed. The larceny charges against me were pending, Sterling was sidelined, and she had successfully petitioned for a temporary title, while the trust was investigated. She was throwing a victory lap, a final gloat before she married Harold and became untouchable. I looked at my reflection. I looked tired. I looked defeated. I made sure my eyes were slightly red, my posture a little slumped. I needed her to see the broken Elara. Arrogance is a blindfold, and I wanted her to wear it tight. You're going? Sterling asked, his voice worried. I have to, I said. She thinks she's the host, but she's just the main course. She thinks she burned the original trust in that motel room. I checked the asset tracker. I had the digital recordings from Maria, the SEC whistleblower confirmation number, and the metadata of the motel fire. The complication was over. Beatrice thought she had me on my knees, but I was just crouching for the spring. I picked up my mother's lavender sachet, tucked it into my sleeve, and stepped out into the night. It was time for the reckoning. The mansion was ablaze with light, a gilded cage for the city's vultures. I stood at the threshold, the valet's eyes lingering on my charcoal blazer before he realized who I was. The air was a thick, nauseating fog of Beatrice's signature vanilla, but beneath my sleeve, a sachet of my mother's dried lavender kept me grounded. Elara, the hostess called out, her voice a shrill symphony of triumph. She was draped in a silver gown, her neck adorned with the sapphire ring she'd claimed I stole. She looked like a queen, but I could see the frantic pulse at her throat. I'm so glad you could make it to see what a real Vance legacy looks like. I wouldn't miss it, Beatrice, I said, my voice as cold and level as a forensic report. I looked at the crowd, the mayor, the bankers, the socialites who had ignored my calls. I didn't see people. I saw a room full of witnesses to a crime they were about to realize they'd participated in. I walked toward the bar, ignoring the whispers. My auditor's brain was counting the minutes. I wasn't here to dine. I was here to close the books on a decade of embezzlement and emotional arson. She thought she'd invited a beggar to her feast, but I was the one who had already bought the restaurant. A toast, Beatrice announced, clinking a crystal glass with a heavy gold spoon. The string quartet faded into an expectant silence. To the future of this estate, and to the strength it takes to prune the dead weight from a family tree. She looked directly at me, her smirk a razor blade. She waited for me to flush, to shout, to make the impulsive outburst she'd prepped Harold for. Instead, I pulled a small remote from my pocket, a device Leo had synced to the house's integrated Sonos system while he was inspecting the beams. I have a toast too, I said, my voice cutting through the room. A recording of my father's final wishes. He wanted everyone to hear the truth about his loving wife. I pressed the button. It wasn't my father's voice. It was Beatrice's, crisp and clear from the recording nurse Maria had made. I don't care about his pain, Maria. Just sign the dementia affidavit. I need the trust voided before the girl finds the original. If you don't, I'll bury you like I'm burying his legacy. The room went tomb quiet. Beatrice's glass didn't just fall. It shattered against the marble, the white wine soaking her silver hem like a stain of cowardice. The double doors swung open. Arthur Sterling entered, flanked by the county sheriff and a man from the district attorney's office. The clerical errors Harold had bought were gone. The SEC whistleblower report had turned the local politics into a radioactive zone. Beatrice Vance, the sheriff said, his voice echoing in the ballroom. I have a court order for your immediate removal from these premises. The Vance Bloodline Trust has been verified by the Federal Forensic Lab. This property is, and has been, the sole possession of Elara Vance. Beatrice lunged toward me, her face a mask of primal fury. I burned it. I watched it turn to ash in that motel. You burned a high-resolution photocopy, Beatrice, I whispered, stepping closer so only she could hear. I'm a forensic auditor. We specialize in redundancy. You destroyed a 20-cent printout while providing me with the metadata for an arson charge. Sterling stepped forward, checking his watch with a dry, ironic smile. It's 9:15 p.m. You have exactly 30 minutes to pack a single bag of personal belongings. Not jewelry, not art, not Vance assets. I suggest you hurry. The locks change very soon. Harold stepped back from Beatrice as if she were a live wire. Beatrice? What is this? Who are these people? He's the next one, Harold, I said, turning to the billionaire. Ask her about her ex-husband in Milan. The one she's been paying wellness fees to for my father's medical account. The one she's still legally married to. I handed him the folder, the original Italian marriage certificates and the wire transfer logs. You aren't marrying a widow, Harold. You're marrying a bigamist who was using your corporate subsidiaries to launder the money she stole from a dying man. The SEC is already at your office. I'd worry less about the ring and more about your board of directors. Harold looked at Beatrice, then at the folder, then at the exits. Without a single word, he turned and walked out of the mansion, leaving her standing alone in the center of the room she had fought so dirty to keep. Beatrice fell to her knees, the silver dress pooling around her like liquid lead. She looked at the guests, her friends, who were all recording her collapse on their phones. The grieving widow was finally getting the viral fame she deserved, but there were no filters for this kind of ruin. By midnight, the house was silent. The victory dinner guests had fled like rats, and Beatrice had been escorted to a patrol car, clutching a plastic trash bag of cheap clothes, the only thing she actually owned. I stood at the top of the marble stairs, the same spot where she had kicked my mother's suitcase down a lifetime ago. I held a lighter to one of her vanilla candles, watched it melt for a second, and then blew it out. I opened every window in the west wing, letting the mountain air scrub the scent of her lies from the curtains. I walked to the library and pulled out a small, hidden floorboard behind the desk. Inside was my mother's real jewelry box, the one I'd hidden there the night before the locks were changed. I put the pearls around my neck. They were cold, then they were warm. I sat at the Louis XIV desk and opened a fresh ledger. The legacy wasn't the house or the money. It was the truth. Beatrice would never call me again. The restraining order and the pending bigamy and fraud charges saw to that. She was a footnote in a case study now. I picked up a pen and began to draft the plans for the Vance Foundation, a center for elder advocacy and forensic legal aid. I took a deep breath. The vanilla was gone. The lavender was home. The audit is closed, Dad, I whispered to the quiet room. The books are balanced.